what I wanted to try to do is talk about first, not just why we went to Afghanistan, which is pretty simple, 3,000 dead people in New York, but what the stakes are. And then the question is, where are we? What's it worth? Should we stay? And where are we now? And I have to tell you, those do not have simple answers. The first part is fairly easy. We went to Afghanistan because the Taliban gave sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, which blew up New York. And it's useful to remember that while we treat it as a matter of terrorism, they treat it as part of a war. Taliban, Al-Qaeda propaganda referred to it as the raid on New York, indicating that from their point of view, it's part of the war, which still goes on. Obviously, the question arises, oh, that's nice, but it's 13 years later, going on 14, is it still worth it? Clearly, given my exposure to Afghanistan, I will not pose as a totally disinterested analyst. I have a certain amount of skin in the game, or at least I had. But my answer is unambiguously yes. That does not answer the second question that I get to in a minute, which is, even if it's worth it, can you do anything about it? The Taliban itself is not an international terrorist organization, but it is clearly linked to another one, and you now have the beginning of Taliban defections to the Islamic State. You also have some from Al-Qaeda. The Islamic State, which we are confronting in Iraq and Syria, is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, which was banished from their ranks for being too extreme. We didn't know that was possible, but now we do. The Taliban movement in Pakistan, which began as an offshoot of the Taliban in Afghanistan, has now become a movement directed against the Pakistani state, and one which is also linked with Al-Qaeda. Pakistan, of course, is a much larger game in a sense than Afghanistan, since it has a much larger population and happens to have nuclear weapons. But being a larger game doesn't mean you can lose in the smaller game, which would then become a rear area for instability in Pakistan. In short, trying to stabilize Afghanistan, I believe, is still a goal which is very worthwhile, which is important to America's national interest, and which is important to our own ability to rebuff a very hostile movement. Now, that does not answer the question, can you do it? And that gets you into, I think, a number of problems. First of all, to my mind, the bottom line is complex, and I think our current media environment is not one which likes complexity particularly. We would like simple bottom lines. We're a media society. We have a 24-hour cycle. You know, we hear about patience. Yeah, patience, I got it. It's been 3 days. What's happening? We really don't do well on long term, and we want to know bottom line. Bottom line is fine if you're running a business, if you're running something where you control all the factors and you can say, here's the plan on progress. It doesn't work quite so well in wars where the enemy gets voted. But it also means that life changes. You know, we thought we had, or at least some people thought we had success in Iraq. We don't have success in Iraq. That doesn't mean, you know, that you can always assume failure or always go with everything forever, but it's just a reminder that life is complex. It doesn't give you easy bottom lines. And then Afghanistan is so complex that if your mind is really made up, you can find the pieces to prove whatever theory you're deeply attached to. And it's sort of a notion that I came to in Vietnam years ago, and I see it happening in Afghanistan. If you've got your mind absolutely made up, and after 13 years of war, a lot of people are pretty set in their opinions, then you can go to a place like Afghanistan, and you can cherry pick the bits that fit your theory, and you can come back and you can write the article or go on the television program and say, I've been there and this is the way it is. If you happen to have an idea which is absolutely 180 degrees diametrically opposed, you can do the same thing. That makes judgment difficult. The fact that our news stories tend to focus only on what's bloody, I don't blame them. That's what sells papers. If you don't sell papers, you've got a business. But there's no interest, especially in editors, in writing good news. That doesn't mean there's tons of good news. It just means you don't get a balanced presentation. And then we have the wonderful Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, who actually is finding a lot of things that are wrong, a lot of things that are justifiably bad and they're worthy of criticism. But he also has a purely peacetime mandate for fiduciary oversight that makes no allowance for war, and which sometimes leads you into rather ridiculous extremes. As I say, a lot of his criticism is justified. But let me give you one example of the kind of extreme. 400,000 plus weapons have gone missing, and maybe in the hands of the Taliban, was one report. What does that actually come down to? It came down to the fact that you can't find them on paper or in the arms rooms because they were issued to a largely illiterate army before we had in place a logistics system. Okay, that's a problem. What was the alternative you wanted? Build the logistics system before you build the army? Build the infantry and tell them, now, okay, you're formed, now just go sit down over there for a year or two until we got the logistics going and then we'll give you a weapon? I mean, it is not that we don't need to build a logistics system and account for the weapons, but it is an absurdity to treat that in isolation, and we have a lot of that kind of thinking going on. What's my own bottom line? Then I will turn to sort of where I think we are right now. My bottom line is way, way too much has been done to say this is a failure. And way too much remains to be done to say that this is a success or that you have anything you can take to the bank and be certain about it. Now that's profoundly destabilizing and bothersome to a lot of people because they want to know. You know, if it's not working, we ought to pack it up and get out. And if it is working, you know, why don't you do more? And what I can tell you is, it hasn't failed, and it isn't sick. In some respects, security is worse than it was a few years ago. I was up in Iraq a few months back in the Northwest, and I would say, well, it's not really bad like the South. It is worse than it was when I left in 2007. On the other hand, big pieces of the South that were virtually completely lost in 2008 have been retaken and are holding. And there is a major improvement in the central Helmand area, in the economy, and Kandahar. You know, you heard lots of news stories about a little place called Marja and Helmand when the battles went down, and they were not easy, and government in a box didn't work for months and months, and there were no Afghan troops. When was the last time you read an article on Marja? Doesn't tell you that there are now 26,000 Afghan security forces of various kinds in Helmand. Doesn't tell you that Marj has been basically quiet, and the two Taliban offensives this last summer against Marj have both failed. You won't read that. On the other hand, you had some very, very difficult fighting in the northern part of the province, and it was a mixed bag. The army didn't do badly, but the police and army coordination wasn't terribly good. There are plenty of things that are not good. On the other hand, the army is holding. You have had no incident. You've had places where they lost some ground, where they were at a small detachment overrun. You've had no places where they broke and ran. Nowhere where they've thrown down their weapons, taken off their uniforms. None of that. And you have a major, major Taliban effort to destabilize the country as we pull out. That's why you are seeing a lot of high-profile attacks in cities. At the same time, you have everything's a mixed picture. It's enough to scramble your brain if you want a simple bottom line. Take the election. 7 million people voted despite Taliban threats. Now that's one heck of a determination to have a better future. That is something to build on. And then you have this incredible amount of fraud that's just disgusting, and which makes you want to, feel bad. But you get out of all this political mess a peaceful political solution between the two contending parties. They're not out arresting each other's supporters, a la Prime Minister Maliki in Iraq. They're not shooting each other down. Whatever amount of fraud you had, you can say that the two of them together, Dr. Abdullah, the chief executive officer, who's been turned, and the new president, Ashraf Ghani, had one heck of a mandate. We're not sure who anybody voted for, but we know that 70% of the electorate voted for the two of them. So as long as they stay together, they actually have quite a popular mandate. So now your question, every question in Afghanistan leads to a new question. I remember at least 5 or 6 years ago, people began to talk about this is the decisive year in Afghanistan. The following year was the decisive year in Afghanistan. After several decisive years in Afghanistan, I gave this some thought, and I thought, you know, it is right in a sense. It's kind of like a really tough college course where you have lots of tests. If you fail one, you're out. That's decisive. If you pass, you get to take the next test. And that is a bit the way Afghanistan is now. So, we now have taken most of our troops out. But I think it is time to give up illusions. I would start with the illusion that is manifest in the phrase that just makes me shudder: we have ended the war. We ain't ended nothing. We have passed off a nasty, bloody, violent conflict to other people to carry the brunt of it, and it's still in our interest that they succeed, but we have not ended. If you want to say we have ended our combat operations, that's mostly correct. Don't say we've ended the war, because we haven't. We have drawn down, but that's okay. Afghans are carrying the brunt. We've pushed the pace a little bit. We've run it probably a little too fast. Maybe that's good, it's made them step up to it, but it also means that we're leaving certain things undone that we're never going to be finished. For instance, they don't have an Air Force yet. That's because we were never going to be done with an Air Force. When I visited in 2010, actually, everything, Air Force logistics, artillery, medical, was all being delayed deliberately by at least a year so we could train infantry. We used every available training facility for infantry, and that made sense. We needed infantry in the battle. Except in 2010, you had no decision with the administration that we were going to cut everything off by 2014. You can tell that to the planners. The lack of an Air Force is partly an Afghan fault. They've had some corruption. We've had massive contract failures. But I would say that there is a moral responsibility that we fill that hole at least until the Air Force we were building that we haven't finished gets done. They can still mess it up beyond belief. If the new government can't work, if they fall apart, if they implode, if they only appoint a cabinet of old warlords to continue the corrupt form of government that we've had, this is going to be really hard. That's not what they've done so far. It's been really hard for them, but they have a new cabinet. Some of them have been turned down by the parliament. We have to see what happens, but at least it's not a group of old warlords. Most of them have degrees. It's a reasonably promising start. We'll have to see if they can govern. They have huge economic problems. They also have a lot more resources than we knew about a few years ago. There is oil, there is gas, there is copper, there's silver, gold, sorry, no silver, just gold. Emeralds, rubies, a few of those things, but not in huge quantities. Rare minerals. None of those are going to be a silver bullet. All of them will take years to utilize, and all of them pose the challenge of whether the state will utilize these things in ways that benefit the state, or whether, sort of in the model of early post-Soviet Russia, they will manage to produce a corrupt set of oligarchs that pillage the ball and get nothing out of it. So I can say again, there's an opportunity, there's not a certainty. But what you have now is a new government with a popular mandate, with a lot of educated people that weren't there before. It's not the country it was 13 years ago. With an army that is prepared to fight, although it is not always good, and it's not always as well qualified as you would like it to be.